Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Military Career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Chapter 3, Expedition to Egypt.
On the 2nd of October, 1797, during Napoleon's absence in Italy, the Directory announced to the French people its intention of carrying the war with England into England itself. The immediate organization of a great invading army was therefore ordered, and Citizen General Bonaparte, the conqueror of Italy, was designated to command the forces. It was some months before this decision was acted upon, however, and in the meantime Napoleon lived quietly in a small, modest house in the Rue Chantereine, which he had occupied before he set out for Italy. Shortly after his return, on going home one evening, he was surprised to find workmen engaged in changing the sign bearing the name of the street to Rue de la Victoire, in commemoration of his Italian campaign. He seemed to avoid as much as possible at this time the honors of popular distinction and applause that the people heaped upon him. One morning he sent his secretary to a theater manager to ask him to give that evening 2 very popular pieces, if such a thing were possible. "Nothing is impossible for General Bonaparte," replied the courtly manager. "The conqueror of Italy has long ago erased that word from the dictionary." This flattering answer afforded Napoleon a hearty laugh. He went to the performance, and although endeavoring to maintain his usual privacy, was discovered and loudly called upon to come forward. The honor which he esteemed most was his nomination as a member of the Institute. He frequently attended its meetings and was also fond of appearing in the costume worn by the members. When congratulated by Bourrienne on some noisy demonstration of popular favor, he answered in the words of Cromwell, "Bah! They would crowd as eagerly about me if I were on my way to the scaffold." Wherever he went, he was still the Bonaparte of Lodi, Arcola, and Rivoli. Meanwhile, the government gave him no adequate reward for his important services in Italy. He had not, when he returned to France, 300,000 francs in his possession, though he had transmitted 50 millions to the state. "I might easily," he said to Las Casas, "have brought back 10 or 12 millions. I never made out any accounts, nor was I ever asked for any." On the eve of his departure for Egypt, he became possessed of Malmaison, and there deposited nearly all his property. He purchased it in the name of his wife, older than himself, and consequently, in case of his surviving her, he must have forfeited all right to the same. The fact, as stated by himself, was that he never had a taste or desire for the acquirement of riches. He willingly accepted the new appointment now pressed upon him by the government, who seemed anxious that he should not remain in Paris to take part in the civil business of the state. In this latter direction, he had no desire for continued service. In Napoleon's own language, the pear was not yet ripe, and like Caesar, he would have preferred being first in a village to being second in Rome. The first scheme of the French Directory was to make a descent upon England and to place Napoleon at the head of the invading army. But their counsels continually fluctuated between this project and the Egyptian expedition. Napoleon said to Bourrienne on the 29th of January, "Bourrienne, I shall remain here no longer. They, the Directory, do not want me. There is no good to be done. They will not listen to me. I see, if I loiter here, I am done for quickly. Here everything grows flat. My glory is already on the wane. This little Europe of yours cannot supply the demand. We must move to the east. All great reputations come from that quarter. But I will first take a turn round the coast to assure myself what can be done. If the success of a descent upon England appears doubtful, as I fear, the army of England shall become the army of the East, and I am off for Egypt." He at length resolved to bring the question of the invasion to a decision by a personal survey of the coast opposite England. While there, he busied himself for a time in suggesting improvements in fortifications and in selecting the best points for embarking an invading force. Many local improvements of great importance, long afterwards effected, were first suggested by him at this period, but the time had not come for invading England. Napoleon had suggested to Talleyrand, Minister of Foreign Affairs, some months before, the propriety of making an effort against England in another quarter of the globe, i.e., of seizing Malta, proceeding to Egypt, and therein gaining at once a territory capable of supplying to France the loss of her West Indian colonies and the means of annoying Great Britain in her Indian trade and empire. The East presented to him a field of conquest and glory, and to this he now again recurred. "Europe is but a molehill," he said. "All the great glories have come from Asia, where there are 600 millions of men." He soon returned to Paris and made his views known to the Directory, declaring that an invasion of England was a wild chimera. To Bourrienne, his school companion, who asked him concerning his contemplated invasion after he had been on the coast a week, he said, "The risk is too great. I shan't venture it. I don't want to trifle with the fate of France." The temptation of the Directory was great, and as it would find employment for Napoleon at a distance from France, the Egyptian expedition was finally determined upon, but kept a great secret. While the attention of Great Britain was now riveted on the coast, it was on the borders of the Mediterranean that his ships and the troops really destined for action were assembling. Everyone wished to accompany Napoleon to the East. Civilians, scholars, engineers, artists, all wished to make the journey. Napoleon selected and equipped the army, raised money, and collected ships. He was employed night and day in the organization of the armament which was to be under his command absolutely. In April and May 1798, the various squadrons of the French fleet were assembled at Toulon, and everything was soon in readiness. The main body was assembled at Toulon, but the embarkment was to take place at Civitavecchia. When asked if he should remain long in Egypt, Napoleon replied, "A few months, or 6 years, it all depends upon circumstances." When all was in readiness, Bonaparte called his vast army together, and in sight of the ships which were to carry them from the shores of France, said to his followers, "Rome fought Carthage on sea as well as on the land. England is the Carthage of France. I have come to lead you, in the name of the divinity of liberty, across mighty seas and into distant regions, where your valor may achieve such life and glory as will never await you beneath the cold skies of the West. Prepare yourselves, soldiers, to embark under the tricolor for achievements far more glorious than you have won for your country on the blushing plains of Italy." He agreed to give each soldier 7 acres of land, and as his promises had not hitherto been violated, the soldiers heard him with joy and prepared to obey him with alacrity. They answered his address with loud cheers and cries of, "Long live the Republic!" The English government vigilantly observed the preparations that were going on and kept a fleet in the Mediterranean under the command of Nelson. It was highly important that the French squadron should sail without delay in order to avoid the risk of being discovered by the English cruisers, but contrary winds detained it for 10 days. This interval was employed by Napoleon in attention to the minutest details connected with the finely appointed force under his command. On the evening of the 19th of May, 1798, fortune favored him, and the troops were all embarked, while the English fleet under Nelson, the Neptune of the seas, was compelled to go into port to repair ships disabled in a violent gale. The French fleet, which was supplied with water for a month and with food for 2 months, carried about 40,000 men of all sorts and 10,000 sailors. In the army were many veteran soldiers, selected from the Army of Italy and commanded by the first generals of France. Kleber, Desaix, Berthier, Renier, Murat, Lannes, Andreassi, Junot, Menou, and Belliard all served in this campaign. Josephine had accompanied her husband to Toulon and remained with him to the last moment. Their farewell was most affecting. As the last of the French troops stepped on board, the sun rose with great brilliancy on the mighty armament, one of those dazzling suns which the soldiers often referred to with delight as the sons of Napoleon, and sails were immediately set for the east. On the 8th of June, the convoys from Italy joined the squadron out at sea. On the 10th, the whole fleet was assembled before Malta. The first object of Napoleon was to take possession of that island. He had already secured a secret party among the knights, and a very slight demonstration of hostilities spread consternation among them, and they opened their gates to the French without delay. Nearly all the knights entered the ranks of the French army. As the French troops passed through the almost impregnable fortifications, General Caffarelli dryly remarked to Napoleon that it was fortunate there was someone to open the gates for them. Had there been no garrison at all, it would have been terrible hard work. Leaving a sufficient garrison in Malta, the French squadron was again under sail on the 16th. While the officers and savants devoted much time to the discussion of military and scientific topics, the great object of excitement and solicitude was to elude the English fleet. The French vessels were encumbered with civil and military baggage, provisions, stores, etc., and densely crowded with troops. Napoleon was anxious to avoid such an encounter. "God grant that we may pass the English without meeting them," he remarked to Admiral Brueys. Nelson was now in full pursuit. At Naples, he heard of their landing at Malta and that their destination was Egypt. He arrived at Malta just after they had left the island and missed overtaking them by an accident. During a hazy night, on which they lay off Candia, the French were alarmed by the report of guns on their starboard, and it afterwards proved that those were signals between the ships of Nelson's fleet. So close were the two hostile squadrons to each other, without being aware of it. Napoleon received positive information of this proximity the following morning and ordered Brueys to steer at once for Cape Aza, about 25 leagues distant from Alexandria. This precaution foiled Nelson, who crowded sail for Alexandria. Napoleon finally reached his destination on the 1st of July undisturbed, the tops of the minarets of Alexandria announcing that his point was gained. As he was reconnoitering the coast at the very moment that danger seemed over, a strange sail appeared on the verge of the horizon. "Fortune," exclaimed he, "I ask but 6 hours more. Wilt thou refuse them?" The vessel proved not to be English, but French, and the disembarkation, near a structure called the Tower of Marabou, 3 leagues to the eastward of Alexandria, immediately took place in spite of a violent gale and a tremendous surf. Egypt was then nominally a province of the Porte, and governed by a Turkish pasha who was at peace with France. Bonaparte met with no opposition in landing, and by 3 o'clock in the morning commenced his march upon Alexandria with 3 divisions of his army. He had little difficulty in entering Alexandria, although he met with resistance, and General Kleber, who commanded the attack, was wounded. The French lost about 200 men. Bonaparte exacted of his troops, under penalty of death, consideration of all the laws and religion of the country, and to the people of Egypt he addressed a proclamation in which he said, "They will tell you that I come to destroy your religion. Believe them not. I come to restore your rights, to punish the usurpers, and I respect, more than the Mamelukes ever did, God, his prophet, and the Koran. Thrice happy they who shall be with us. Woe unto them that take up arms for the Mamelukes. They shall perish." The Mamelukes were considered by Napoleon to be, individually, the finest cavalry in the world. They rode the noblest horses of Arabia and were armed with the best weapons which the world could produce: carbines, pistols, etc., from England, and sabers of the steel of Damascus. Their skill in horsemanship was equal to their fiery valor. With that cavalry and the French infantry, Bonaparte said it would be easy to conquer the world. Napoleon himself remained some days in Alexandria and left on the 7th of July, leaving Kleber in command, being anxious to force the Mamelukes to an encounter with the least possible delay. General Desaix was sent forward with 4,500 men to Beta. The commission of learned men remained at Alexandria until Napoleon should reach Cairo, with the exception of Monge and Berthollet, who accompanied the commander. The march over the burning sands of the desert brought extreme misery and unheard of sufferings to the troops. The air was full of pestiferous insects. The glare of the sand weakened the men's eyes, and water was scarce and bad. Even the gallant spirits of Murat and Lannes could not sustain themselves, and they trampled their brilliant cockades in the sand in a fit of rage in the presence of the troops. The common soldiers asked, with sarcastic or angry murmurs, if it was here the general designed to give them their 7 acres of land. "The rogue," said they, "he might, with safety, have promised us as much as we pleased. We should not abuse his good nature." They, however, bore a grudge against Caffarelli, who they thought had advised the expedition, and used to say, as he hobbled past with his wooden leg, "He does not care what happens. He is sure to have 1 foot at least in France." Napoleon alone was superior to all these evils. It required, however, more than his example of endurance and the general influence of his firm character to prevent the army from breaking into open mutiny. "Once," said he at St. Helena, "I threw myself amidst a group of generals, and, addressing myself to the tallest of their number with vehemence, said, 'You have been talking sedition. Take care lest I fulfill my duty. Your 5 feet 10 inches would not hinder you from being shot within 2 hours.'" On the 10th of July, 1798, the army reached the Nile at Ramanieh. "We no sooner saw the river," says Savary in his memoirs, "than soldiers, officers, and all rushed into it. Each, regardless whether it was sufficiently shallow to afford security from danger, only sought to quench his burning thirst, and stooped to drink from the stream, the whole army presenting the appearance of a flock of sheep. We encamped," says Napoleon, "on immense quantities of wheat, but there was neither mill nor oven in the country. The men bruised the grain between stones and baked it in the ashes or parched and boiled it. The army soon moved on towards Cairo, but the men were unable to leave the ranks for a single instant without certain death from the spears or scimitars of those matchless Mameluke horsemen, and therefore, although so near the Nile, several fell dead from thirst. But the worriment of their minds was their worst evil. They began to say there was no great city of Cairo, that they believed it would prove only a collection of wretched huts. In this state they came up, on the 13th, with the Mamelukes at Shebrais. They were drawn up in battle array under Murad Bey, one of their most powerful chiefs, and were a magnificent body of cavalry, glittering with gold and silver, and mounted on splendid horses. The battle commenced without a moment's hesitation on either side. Each Mameluke, feeling in himself the valor of a host, rushed in the singleness of his purpose as if alone against the opposing mass, and with repeated charges endeavored, by every means of unbridled fury or consummate skill, to break the solid squares of the French army. They were at length beaten back with the loss of about 300. After the action at Shebrais, the French army continued to advance during 8 days without opposition of any enemy except the hovering Arabs who lay in wait for every straggler from the main column. The order of march towards Cairo was systematically arranged. Each division of the army moved forward in squares, 6 men deep on each side. The artillery was at the angles, and in the center, the ammunition, the baggage, and the small body of cavalry still remaining. Napoleon himself, when he rode, always made use of a dromedary, though he at first suffered a sensation resembling seasickness from its peculiar motion. "I never passed the desert," said he some time later, "without experiencing very painful emotions. It was the image of immensity to my thoughts. It showed no limits. It had neither beginning nor end. It was an ocean for the foot of man." On the 19th of July, the soldiers' eyes were gladdened by the sight of the Grand Pyramids on the horizon. Still advancing towards Cairo, the distant monuments swelling upon the eye at every step, the army reached Mbabe on the 21st and found the Mamelukes in battle array to dispute their further progress. While every eye was fixed on these hoary monuments of the past, Napoleon sighted with his glass a vast army of the Beys spread out before him. The right posted on an entrenched camp by the Nile, its center and left composed of that brilliant cavalry with which they were by this time acquainted. Napoleon perceived, too, and what had escaped the observation of all his staff, that the 40 pieces of cannon on the entrenched camp of the enemy were without carriages, and consequently could be leveled in but one direction. He instantly decided on his plan of attack by preparing to throw his forces on the left, where the guns could not be available. Murad Bey, who commanded the Mamelukes, penetrated the French commander's design, and his followers at once advanced gallantly to the encounter. "Soldiers, you are about to fight the rulers of Egypt," said Napoleon, as he raised his hands high in the air and formed his troops into separate squares to meet the assault. "From the summits of yonder pyramids, 40 centuries behold you." These imposing and mysterious witnesses were not appealed to in vain, and the great battle began at once at the foot of the ancient and gigantic monuments, the French advancing in 5 grand squares, Napoleon heading the center square. In an instant, the Mamelukes came charging up with impetuous speed and loud cries. They rushed on the line of bayonets, backed their horses upon them, and at last, maddened by the firmness which they could not shake, dashed their pistols and carbines into the faces of the French troops. The first maneuver of the French army disconcerted the plans of the Mamelukes. Still, they continued to charge. The places of the dead and dying were instantly supplied by new warriors, who fell in their turn. They daringly penetrated even between the spaces occupied by the squares commanded by Renier and Desaix, so that the desperate horsemen were exposed to the incessant fire of both faces of the divisions at the distance of 50 paces. Many of the French fell from each other's fire in the resistance to this act of desperation. Those who had fallen wounded from their seats crawled along the sand and hewed at the legs of their enemies with their scimitars, but nothing could move the intrepid French. Bayonets and the continued roll of musketry by degrees thinned the host around them. When Bonaparte at last advanced with his battalions upon the main body and divided one part from the other, such was the confusion and terror of the Mamelukes that they abandoned their works and flung themselves by hundreds into the Nile. The carnage was prodigious. Thousands were left bleeding on the sands, and multitudes more were drowned. It was the custom of the Mamelukes to carry their treasures with them on their bodies when they went to battle, and every one that fell made a French soldier rich for life, as the bodies of the slain were all rifled. In his report of the engagement, Bonaparte said, "After the great number of battles in which the troops I command have been opposed to superior strength, I cannot but praise their discipline and coolness on this occasion. For this novel species of warfare has made them display a patience contrasting oddly with French impetuosity. If they had given way to their ardor, they would not have gained the victory, which was only to be obtained by great calmness and patience." The cavalry of the Mamelukes evinced great bravery. They defended their fortunes, for there was not one of them upon whom our soldiers did not find 3, 4, or 500 gold pieces. Savary, who fought in Desaix's division, which had to stand the first attack of the Mamelukes, has given a striking description of the impression produced by their furious onset. "Although," he says, "the troops that were in Egypt had been long inured to danger, every one present at the Battle of the Pyramids must acknowledge, if he be sincere, that the charge of the Mamelukes was most awful, and that there was reason, at one moment, to apprehend their breaking through our formidable squares, rushing upon them, as they did, with a confidence which enforced silence in our ranks, interrupted only by the word of command. It seemed as if we must inevitably be trampled in an instant under the feet of this cavalry of Mamelukes, who were all mounted upon splendid chargers, richly caparisoned with gold and silver trappings, covered with draperies of all colors and waving scarfs, and who were bearing down upon us at full gallop, rending the air with their cries. The whole character of this imposing sight filled the breasts of our soldiers with sensations to which they had hitherto been strangers, and made them vividly attentive to the word of command. The order to fire was executed with a quickness and precision far exceeding what is exhibited in an exercise or upon parade. More than 50 pieces of cannon and 400 loaded camels became the spoil of the conquerors. Murad and a remnant of 2,000 of his Mamelukes retreated on Upper Egypt. These were all that escaped with life out of the matchless body of men who, in such superb array, had bid scornful defiance to the European invaders only a few hours before. Cairo surrendered, Lower Egypt was entirely conquered. Such were the immediate consequences of the Battle of the Pyramids. Many of the promiscuous rabble of infantry reached Cairo in advance of the French, and there they spread realistic accounts of the dreadful power of Napoleon and his army. The name of Bonaparte now spread panic through the East, and the victor was considered invincible. The inhabitants called him King of Fire. From the deadly effect of the musketry in the engagement at the Pyramids, which decided the conquest of the country. By the earliest dawn, the victor prepared to take possession of the conquest he had made, but was spared all difficulties by its unconditional surrender. A deputation of the sheiks and chief inhabitants waited upon him at his headquarters in the country house of Mourad Bey to implore his clemency and submit to his power. He received them with the greatest kindness and informed them of his friendly intentions towards them, and that his hostility was entirely confined to the Mamelukes. Cairo and its citadel were immediately occupied by the French troops, and on the 24th of July, Napoleon made his public entry into the capital amidst a great concourse of people. The savants who accompanied Bonaparte on the expedition lost no time in taking advantage of their opportunities, and at once began to ransack the monuments of antiquity and founded collections which reflected much honor on their zeal and skill. Napoleon himself, accompanied by many officers of his staff, visited the interior of the Great Pyramid of Cheops, attended by many muftis and imams, and on entering the secret chamber in which, 3,000 years before, some pharaoh had been interred, repeated once more his confession of faith. There is no God but God, and Mohammed is his prophet. The learned Orientals who accompanied him responded with sarcastic solemnity, "Thou hast spoken like the most learned of the prophets, but God is merciful." 10 days after the battle at the pyramids had been fought and won, Nelson, who had scoured the Mediterranean in quest of Napoleon, discovered the French fleet, commanded by Admiral Brueys, at anchor in the Bay of Aboukir. A terrific engagement ensued, lasting 24 hours, including a whole night. A solitary pause occurred at midnight when the French ship Orient, a superb vessel of 120 guns, took fire and blew up in the heart of the conflicting squadrons, with an explosion that for a moment silenced rage in awe. Admiral Brueys himself perished. The next morning, 2 shattered ships out of all the French fleet with difficulty made their escape to the sea. The rest of the magnificent fleet was utterly destroyed or remained in the hands of the English, who have since called the engagement the Battle of the Nile. The ships were arranged in a semicircular, compact line of battle, and so close to the shore that Brueys had supposed it was impossible to get between them and the land. But his daring enemy, who well knew all the surroundings, soon convinced him of his mistake. The van of the English fleet, 6 in number, successfully rounded the French line, dropping anchor between it and the shore, and opened their fire, while Nelson, with his other ships, ranged along it on the outer side, and so placed the French fleet between 2 tremendous fires. Admiral Brueys was wounded early in the action, but continued to command with the utmost energy. When he fell mortally wounded, he would not suffer himself to be carried below. "A French admiral ought to die on his quarter-deck," he replied to the entreaties of his friend Ganthaume, who succeeded him. It was on his return from Salahieh to Cairo, whither Napoleon had pursued the Mameluke chief, Ibrahim Bey, and defeated him, that he was met by a messenger with information of the destruction of the French fleet by Nelson in the roads of Aboukir. It was a terrible blow to Napoleon, who was thus shut off from all intercourse with France. His soldiers were thus completely isolated, hundreds of miles from home, and compelled to rely on their own arms and the resources of Egypt. He had been so anxious about the fleet as to write twice to Admiral Brueys to repeat the order that he should enter the harbor of Alexandria, or sail for Corfu. He had also, previously to leaving Cairo, dispatched Julian, his aide-de-camp, to enforce the order. But this unfortunate officer was surrounded and killed, with his escort, at a village on the Nile, where he had landed to obtain provisions. A solitary sigh escaped Napoleon when he heard the news. "To the army of France," said he, "the fates have decreed the empire of the land, to England the sovereignty of the seas." Some years later, on learning of the results of the terrible naval battle at Trafalgar, in which Nelson was again victorious, but which cost him his life, Napoleon repeated this remark, adding, "Well, I cannot be everywhere." The seamen who had landed at Alexandria were now formed into a marine brigade, and made a valuable addition to the army. Very soon afterwards, the Porte declared war against France. Public improvements of various kinds were now begun at Cairo and Alexandria under Bonaparte's direction, and many continue to this day. In all quarters, the highest discipline was preserved, and Napoleon exerted all the energy of his nature to increase the resources which remained to him and to preserve and organize Egypt as a French province. At each step of his advance, says Savary, General Bonaparte quickly foresaw everything that was to be done to render available the resources of the most fertile country in the world and give them a suitable application. So quickly had his mind recovered its tone that, on the 21st of August, only a week after he had learned of the destruction of his fleet at Aboukir, he founded an institute at Cairo, exactly on the model of that learned society in France. Monge was president, Napoleon himself, vice president. At Cairo, a terrible insurrection occurred on the 21st of October, but it was soon put down by the French troops after a bitter struggle in which many soldiers lost their lives. Napoleon was in the thickest of the conflict on horseback in the center of 30 guides and soon restored confidence among his soldiers. Tranquility was restored in 3 days, after which many of the leaders were put to death. The others were pardoned. Napoleon now proceeded to explore the Isthmus of Suez, where a narrow neck of land divides the Red Sea from the Mediterranean. He visited the Maronite monks of Mount Sinai, and as Mohammed had done before him, affixed his name to their charter of privileges. He examined also the fountains of Moses, and on the 28th of December, 1798, nearly lost his life in exploring, during low water, the sands of the Red Sea, where Pharaoh is supposed to have perished while in pursuit of the Hebrews. "The night overtook us," says Savary. "The waters began to rise around us. The guard in advance exclaimed that their horses were swimming. Bonaparte saved us all by one of those simple expedients which occur to an imperturbable mind. Placing himself in the center, he bade all the rest circle around him and then ride out, each man in a separate direction, and each to halt as soon as he found his horse swimming. The man whose horse continued to march the last was sure, he said, to be in the right direction. Then accordingly we all followed and reached Suez at 2 a.m. in safety, though so rapidly had the tide advanced that the water was at the breastplate of our horses ere we made the land." In referring to this narrow escape from sharing the fate of Pharaoh, Napoleon remarked to Las Casas, "This would have furnished all the preachers in Christendom with a splendid text against me." On his return to Cairo, Bonaparte dispatched a trusty messenger into India, inviting Tipu Saib to inform him of the condition of the English army in that section, and declaring that Egypt was only the first port in a march destined to surpass that of Alexander. According to his secretary, he spent whole days in lying flat on the ground, stretched on maps of Asia. After having passed the balance of the year at Cairo, the commander declared the time for action had now arrived. Leaving 15,000 men in and about Cairo, the division of Dessaix in Upper Egypt, and garrisons in the chief towns, Bonaparte, on the 11th of February, 1799, marched for Syria at the head of 10,000 picked men, with the intention of crushing the Turkish armaments in that quarter before their chief force, which he learned was assembling at Rhodes, should have time to reach Egypt by sea. The hostility of the port, which would of course be encouraged and assisted by England, implied impending danger on 2 points: the approach of a Turkish army via Syria and the landing of another on the coast of the Mediterranean under the protection of British ships. The necessity of forestalling their designs by an expedition to Syria was therefore apparent. In January 1799, 2 Turkish armies were assembled, one at Rhodes, the other in Syria. The former was intended to make a descent upon the coast of Egypt at Aboukir. The latter had already pushed forward its advance guard to El Arish, a fort within the Egyptian territory, had established large magazines at Gaza, and landed at Jaffa a train of artillery of 40 guns. Traversing the desert 75 leagues across, which divides Egypt from Syria, with about 12,000 men, one regiment being mounted on dromedaries, Napoleon took possession of the fortress El Arish on February 17th, after a vigorous assault. The march was made rapidly and in good order. Having resolved upon an immediate expedition into Syria, he did not wait to be attacked on both sides at the same time, but according to his usual custom, determined to push forward and encounter one division of his enemies at a time. He addressed 2 letters to the Pasha of Syria, surnamed Jezar, or the Butcher, from his horrible cruelties, offering him friendship and alliance. But the Pasha observed a contemptuous silence as to the first communication, and replied to the second in his favorite fashion, seized the messenger, and cut off his head. There was, consequently, nothing to be done with Jezar, but to fight him with such generals as Kleber, Bessieres, Caffarelli, Murat, Lannes, Junot, and Berthier. Pursuing his march, Napoleon took Gaza, the ancient city of the Philistines, without serious opposition, although 3,000 or 4,000 of Jezar's horse were drawn up to oppose them. At Jaffa, the Joppa of Holy Writ, the Moslems made a resolute defense on March 6th, but at length the walls were carried by storm. 3,000 Turks died with arms in their hands in defense of the city, and the town was given up for 3 hours to pillage more savage than Napoleon had ever before permitted. This was followed by a massacre of hundreds of the barbarians who were marched out of Jaffa some distance from the town, in the center of a battalion under General Bonn, divided into small parties and shot or bayoneted to a man. Like true fatalists, they submitted in silence, and their bodies were gathered into a pyramid, where for half a century their bones were still visible in the whitening sand. Napoleon, while admitting that the act was one of the darkest stains on his name that he had to acknowledge, still justified himself on the double plea that he could not afford soldiers to guard so many prisoners, estimated variously from 1,200 to 3,000, and that he could not grant them the benefit of parole because they were the very men who had already been set free by him on such terms at El Arish, after they had given their word not to serve against him for a year. "Now," said Napoleon at St. Helena, "if I had spared them again and sent them away on their parole, they would directly have gone to St. Jean d'Acre, where they would have played me over again the same trick that they had done at Jaffa. In justice to the lives of my soldiers, since every general ought to consider himself as their father, and them as his children, I could not allow this. To leave as a guard a portion of my army, already small and reduced in number, in consequence of the breach of faith of those wretches, was impossible. I therefore ordered that the prisoners should be singled out and shot. I would do the same thing tomorrow, and so would any general commanding an army under such circumstances." Napoleon now ascertained that the Pasha of Syria was at St. Jean d'Acre, so renowned in the history of the Crusades, and determined to defend that place to extremity with the force which had already been assembled for the invasion of Egypt. Sir Sidney Smith, with 2 ships of war, was cruising before the port, and the garrison was assisted by European science. The French army moved on Acre, eager for revenge, while the necessary apparatus of a siege was ordered to be sent round by sea from Alexandria. Sir Sidney Smith was informed by Jezar of the approaching storm and hastened to support him in the defense of Acre. Napoleon's vessels, conveying guns and stores from Egypt, fell into his hands, and he appeared off the town 2 days before the French army came in view of it. He was permitted to regulate the plan of defense, turning Napoleon's own cannon against him from the walls. Napoleon commenced the siege on the 18th of March and opened his trenches immediately on his arrival. "On that little town," he said to one of his generals, as they were standing together on an eminence, "on yonder little town depends the fate of the East. Behold the key of Constantinople or of India." "The moment Acre falls," he said about the same time to Bourrienne, "all the Druzes of Mount Lebanon will join me. The Syrians, weary of Jezar's oppressions, will crowd to my standard. I shall march upon Constantinople with an army to which the Turks can offer no effectual resistance, and it is not unlikely that I may return to France by the route of Adrianople and Vienna, destroying the House of Austria on my way." For 10 days, the French labored hard in their trenches, being exposed to the fire of extensive batteries, formed chiefly of Bonaparte's own artillery. On March 28th, however, a breach was at last effected, and the French mounted with such fiery zeal that the garrison gave way. Shortly afterwards, Jezar himself appeared on the battlements, and flinging his pistols at the head of his flying men, urged and compelled them to renew the defense, which they finally did, causing the French to retreat with great loss. In the meantime, Junot, having marched with his division to encounter a large Mussulman army that had been gathered among the mountains of Samaria and was preparing to descend upon Acre, Napoleon was compelled to follow him to Nazareth, where he was rescued on April 8th. Here, as usual, the splendid cavalry of the Orientals were unable to resist the solid squares and well-directed musketry of the French. General Kleber, with another division, was in like manner rescued by the general-in-chief at Mount Thabor on April 15th, after the former had fought against fearful odds from 6 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. Napoleon now returned to the siege of Acre with all possible dispatch, pressed it on with desperate assaults day after day, losing many of his best soldiers. Accustomed to the easy victories which he had obtained on every encounter with the Turkish forces in Syria, he was not prepared to expect the determined resistance by which his progress was now arrested. Acre is surrounded by a wall flanked with towers, and was further defended by a broad and deep ditch with strong works. At one time, the French succeeded in forcing their way into the great tower and in establishing themselves in one part of it for a time, despite all opposition. But they were finally dislodged. Each advantage ended with itself, and no progress was made towards subduing the place. At another time, a break was made in the walls in a distant part of the town, and a French party entered Acre at the opening. Djezzar then threw such a crowd of Turks upon them that all discipline was lost, and nearly every French soldier met death. The brave Lannes, who headed the party, was with difficulty rescued after being desperately wounded. During this siege, Napoleon sent an officer with an order to the most exposed position. He was killed. He sent another, who was also killed, and so with a third. The order was imperative, and Bonaparte had but 2 aides with him, Eugene Beauharnais and Lavalette. He signaled to the latter to come forward and said to him in a low voice so that Eugene could not hear, "Take this order, Lavalette. I don't want to send this boy and have him killed so young. His mother, Josephine, has entrusted him to me. You know what life is. Go." The aide returned in safety. On another occasion during the siege, a piece of shell struck Eugene on the head. He fell and lay for a long time under the ruins of a wall which the shell had knocked down. Bonaparte thought he was killed and uttered a cry of grief. The youth was only wounded, however, and at the end of 19 days asked leave to return to his post in order to take part in the other assaults, which failed like the first, in spite of Bonaparte's obstinacy. "This wretched hole," said he, "has cost me a good deal of time and a great many men, but things have gone too far. I must try one last assault." An instance of the enthusiastic attachment which Napoleon was capable of inspiring occurred during this memorable siege. One day, when the commander was in the trenches, a shell thrown by Sir Sidney Smith fell at his feet. 2 grenadiers immediately rushed towards him, placed him between them, and raised their arms above his head so as to completely cover every part of his body. The shell burst without injuring one of the group, although they were covered with sand. Both these grenadiers were made officers immediately. One of them, subsequently, was the General Dumisnil, so much talked of 1814, for his resolute defense of Vincennes against the Russians. He had lost a leg in the campaign of Moscow, and to the summons to surrender, he replied, "Give me back my leg, and I will give up the fortress." The fate of his heroic companion is not recorded. The siege had now continued for 60 days. Napoleon once more commanded an assault on the 8th of May, and his officers and soldiers obeyed him with devoted but fruitless gallantry. "That Sidney Smith," he said later, "made me miss my fortune." The loss his army had by this time undergone was very great, and the hearts of all the men were quickly sinking. Among the officers and men who fell on this memorable 8th of May was Crozier, the aide-de-camp, who had incurred the commander's displeasure at Jaffa. Napoleon had once before been violently irritated against him for some seeming neglect at Cairo, and the word coward had escaped him. The feelings of Crozier, then deeply affected, had become insupportable since the event at Jaffa, and he sought death at every opportunity. On this day, Napoleon observed the tall figure of his unfortunate aide-de-camp mounted on a battery, exposed to the thickest of the enemy's fire, and called loudly and imperatively, "Crozier, come down! You have no business there." Crozier neither replied nor moved. The next instant he received his death wound. A Turkish fleet had now arrived to reinforce Djezzar, and upon the utter failure of the attack of the 21st of May, the 11th different attempt to carry the place by assault, Napoleon yielded to stern necessity, raised the siege, and began his retreat upon Jaffa. On leaving this latter place some 6 days after, a number of plague patients in the hospitals were found to be in a state that held out no hope of their recovery, and the commander, unwilling to leave them to the cruel practices of the Turks, suggested that opium be administered by one of the medical staff as a speedy death. The various accounts of this incident in no way agree in detail. Bonaparte denied at St. Helena that the opium was given, but said that the patients, 7 in number, were abandoned. He declared also that if his own son had been among the number, he would have advised that it be done, rather than to leave them to suffer the tortures of the Turks. Sir Sidney Smith found 7 alive in the hospitals when he came up. A rear guard had been left to protect them, and they probably galloped off before the English entered the place. Bourrienne, who acted as secretary to Napoleon at this time, gives a different account, while others assert that 500 men were thus disposed of. The real facts will probably never be known, although both Hazlitt and Sir Walter Scott acquit Napoleon of all blame after a careful investigation of all the facts. That Bonaparte's motives were good, his enemies generally admit, as he seems to have designed, by shortening these men's lives, to do them the best service in his power. The retreating march was a continued scene of misery. The wounded and sick were many, the heat oppressive, and the burdens almost intolerable. Dejected by the sight of so much suffering, Napoleon issued an order that every horse, mule, and camel should be given up to the sick, wounded, and infected. Shortly afterwards, one of his attendants came to ask which horse he wished to reserve for himself. "Scoundrel!" the commander cried. "Do you not know the order? Let everyone march on foot, I the first! Begone!" He accordingly, during the rest of the march, walked by the side of the sick, cheering them to hope for recovery, and exhibiting to all the soldiery the example at once of endurance and compassion. As he had done in Italy, Napoleon always shared the privations and fatigue of the army, and their extremities were sometimes so great that the troops were compelled to contend with each other for the smallest comforts. Upon one occasion in the desert, the soldiers would scarcely allow their general to dip his hands in a muddy pool of water, and when passing the ruins of Pelusium, almost suffocated by heat, a soldier yielded him the ruins of an ancient doorway beneath which he contrived to shade his head for a few minutes, and which Napoleon observed was no trifling favor. On the march between Caesarea and Jaffa, Napoleon very narrowly escaped death. Many of the men had by this time regained their horses, owing to the continual death of the wretched objects who had been mounted upon them. The commander was so exhausted that he had fallen asleep on his horse. A little before daybreak, a native, concealed among the bushes close to the roadside, took aim at his head and fired. The ball missed. The man was pursued, caught, and ordered to be instantly shot. 4 guides drew their triggers, but all their carbines hung fire, owing to the extreme humidity of the night. The Syrian leaped into the sea, which was close to the road, swam to a ledge of rocks, which he mounted and there stood, undaunted and untouched by the shots of the whole troop, who fired at him as they pleased. Napoleon left Bourrienne behind to wait for Kleber, who formed the rear guard, and to order him not to forget the Naplusian. It is not certain that he was shot at last. On his return to Cairo on the 14th of June, 1799, after a march of 25 days, Napoleon once more re-established himself in his former headquarters. But he had not long occupied himself with the establishment of a new government for Egypt, which was then in a state of perfect tranquility, when word came to him of a probable uprising at Alexandria. The commander therefore decided to go there at once. He arrived on the 24th of July and found his army posted in the neighborhood of Abu Qir, prepared to anticipate an attack of the Turks which had appeared off Abu Qir under the protection of 2 British ships commanded by Sir Sidney Smith on the morrow. Surveying their entrenched camp from the heights above, the commander said to Murat, "Go how it may, the battle of tomorrow will decide the fate of the world." "Of this army at least," answered Murat, "but the Turks have no cavalry, and if ever infantry were charged to the teeth by horse, they shall be so by mine," a promise which the brave cavalry leader made good. Next morning, the Turkish outposts were attacked, and the enemy driven in with great slaughter. The retreat might have ended in a rout, but for the eagerness of the enemy who engaged in the task of spoiling and maiming those who fell before them. This gave to Murat the opportunity of charging the main body, which had been drawn up in battle array on the field, in flank with his cavalry. From that moment, the engagement was no longer a battle, but a massacre. The French infantry, under the rallying eye of Napoleon, forced a passage to the entrenchments, and attacking the Turks on all sides, caused them to throw themselves headlong into the waves, rather than await the fury of the French cavalry and the steady fire of the artillery. The sea at first appeared literally covered with turbines. It was only when weary with slaughter that quarter was given to about 6,000 men, the rest of the Turkish army, consisting of 18,000 having perished on the field or in the sea. 6,000 were taken prisoners. The defeat of the Turks at Abukir filled the French soldiers at Cairo with extreme rapture. Murat was promoted to the rank of a general of division, and Napoleon ordered his name and that of Roy's and the numbers of the regiments of cavalry present at the battle engraved upon pieces of brass cannon. Mustafa Pasha, the commanding general of the Turks, on being brought into the presence of his victor, was saluted with these words: "It has been your fate to lose this day, but I will take care to inform the Sultan of the courage with which you have contested it." "Spare thyself that trouble," answered the proud Pasha. "My master knows me better than thou." On the evening after the battle, General Kleber embraced Bonaparte and said to him, "General, you are as great as the world." "It is not written on high that I am to perish by the hands of the Arabs," replied Napoleon. This splendid and most decisive victory at Abukir concluded Bonaparte's career in the East. It was imperiously necessary, ere he could have ventured to quit the command of the army, that he should have to his credit some such glory after the retreat from Syria. It preserved his credit with the public and enabled him to state that he left Egypt for the time in absolute security. After the engagement, Napoleon sent a flag of truce to Sir Sidney Smith, and an interchange of civilities commenced between the English and the French. This circumstance, trifling in itself, led to important consequences. Among other things, a copy of a French journal, dated the 10th of June 1799, was sent ashore by Sir Sidney Smith. No news from France had reached Egypt for 10 months. Napoleon seized the paper with eagerness, and its contents verified his worst fears. He had said some time before, while at Acre, that he feared France was in trouble. As he opened the paper, he exclaimed, "My God, my presentiment is realized. The imbeciles have lost Italy. All the fruits of our victories are gone. I must leave Egypt." He then spent the whole night in his tent reading a file of the English newspapers which had been furnished him. From these he learned of Suwarrow's victories over the French in Italy and of the disastrous internal state of France. In the morning, Admiral Ganthaume received hasty orders to prepare the 2 frigates Muron and Carrère and 2 corvettes for sea with the utmost secrecy and dispatch, furnishing them with 2 months' provisions for 500 men. Napoleon returned to Cairo on the 9th of August, but it was only to make some parting arrangements as to the administration of affairs there, for he had resolved to entrust Egypt to other hands and at once set out for France. He reached Alexandria once more, and was there met by those whom he had decided should make the return voyage with him. He selected Berthier, Lannes, Murat, Marmont, and Andreassi with 500 picked men to accompany him. These, with Monge and Dinan, proceeded to depart from Alexandria without delay. On the 18th, a courier from Ganthaume brought information that Sir Sidney Smith had left the coast to take water at Cyprus. This was the signal for Napoleon's instant departure. On the morning of August 23, 1799, Bonaparte and his chosen followers embarked at Rosetta on 2 frigates and 2 smaller vessels, which had been saved in the harbor of Alexandria. A lack of water and an accident to one of the English ships had compelled the enemy to raise the blockade and so favored his departure. In writing to the Divan and announcing his departure, he said, "Remind the Mussulmen frequently of my love for them. Acquaint them that I have 2 great means to conduct men persuasion and force. With the one I gain friends, and with the other I destroy my enemies." General Kleber was now placed in command of the army of Egypt by Napoleon, who informed his successor of the reasons of his departure for France, and his intention of sending recruits and munitions at the earliest possible moment. He said to Kleber, The army which I confide to you is composed of my children. In all times, even in the midst of the greatest sufferings, I have received the mark of their attachment. Keep alive in them these sentiments. You owe this to the particular esteem and true attachment which I bear myself towards you. The French frigates had hardly passed from sight of land when they were reconnoitered by an English corvette, a circumstance which seemed of evil augury. Bonaparte assured his companions by his usual allusions to his own destiny, which he declared would protect him on sea as well as land. "We will arrive safe," said he. "Fortune will never abandon us. We will arrive safe despite the enemy." Napoleon left no responsibility upon the admiral to whom the various maneuvers have been ascribed. "As if," says Bourrienne, "anyone could command when Bonaparte was present." By express directions of Napoleon, the squadron, instead of taking the ordinary course, kept close to the African coast in the direction of the southern point of Sardinia, his intention being to take a northerly course along the northern coast of that island. He had irrevocably determined that should the English fleet appear, he would run ashore, make his way with the little army under his command to Oran, Tunis, or some other port, and thence find another opportunity of getting to France. The entire voyage was one of constant peril, for the Mediterranean was traversed in all directions by English ships of war. For 21 days, adverse winds, blowing from west or northwest, continually drove the squadron on the Syrian coast, or back towards Alexandria. It was once proposed that they should again put into that port, but Napoleon would not hear of it, declaring that he would brave any danger. On the 30th of September, he reached Ajaccio and was received with enthusiasm at the place of his birth. But according to his own phrase, it rained cousins, and he was wearied with solicitations. "What will become of me," he said, "if the English who are cruising hereabouts should learn that I have landed in Corsica? I shall be forced to stay here, that I could never endure. I have a torrent of relations pouring upon me." His brilliant reputation, says Bourrienne, had prodigiously augmented his family connections, and from the great number of his pretended godchildren, it might have been thought that he had held 1/4 of the children of Ajaccio at the baptismal font. It was during his stay in Corsica that Napoleon first heard of the loss of the Battle of Novi by the French army and of the death of Joubert. "But for that confounded quarantine," he exclaimed, "I would hasten ashore and place myself at the head of the army of Italy. All is not over, and I am sure that there is not a general who would refuse me the command. The news of the victory gained by me would reach Paris as soon as the Battle of Aboukir. That indeed would be excellent." On the 7th of October, the voyage was at last resumed, the winds being again favorable, and on the morning of the 9th, after a narrow escape from the English, he moored in safety in the Bay of Frejus. The story he brought of the victory of Aboukir gave new fuel to the flame of universal enthusiasm, and Napoleon's return to Paris bore all the appearance of a triumphal procession. The shouts of welcome with which he was hailed were echoed by the whole population of France. He returned from Egypt as a conqueror, although almost alone. Yet Providence designed in this apparently deserted condition that he should be the instrument of more astonishing changes than the greatest efforts of the greatest conquerors had ever before been able to effect upon the civilized world. Napoleon was regarded as the champion of liberty, as well as the successful military leader, and none of his actions or expressed opinions had as yet contradicted such an estimation of his principles. The campaign in Egypt was of little service to France, but to Napoleon it was most useful. Of the aides-de-camp whom he took with him, 4 perished there: Crozier, Salkowski, Guibert, and Julien. 2, Duroc and Eugene Beauharnais, were wounded. Lavalette and Marilyn alone returned safe and sound. Bonaparte had the highest regard for Josephine's son Eugene. He was brave and manly, and although a youth of 17, soon won Bonaparte's lasting affection. If there was a dangerous duty to ride into the desert and reconnoiter the bands of Arabs or Mamelukes, Eugene was always the first to volunteer. One day, when he was hastening forward with his usual eagerness, Bonaparte called him back, saying, "Young man, remember that in our business we must never seek danger. We must be satisfied with doing our duty, doing it well, and leaving the rest to God." At the capital, Napoleon was received with every demonstration of joy by the French people, who now looked upon him as their liberator. All parties seemed to be weary of the Directory and to demand the decisive interference of the unrivaled soldier. On his return, he was much surprised to learn of the real condition of France, and to an emissary of Barras he said with some degree of feeling, "What have you done with that land of France, which I left to your care in so magnificent a condition? I bequeathed you peace, and on my return find war. I left you the memory of victories, and now I have come back to face defeats. I left with you the millions I had gathered in Italy, and today I see nothing in every direction but laws despoiling the people, coupled with distress. What have you done with the 100,000 of French citizens, my companions in glory, all of whom I knew? You have sent them to their death. This state of things cannot last, for it would lead us to despotism, and we require liberty reposing on a basis of equality." The Directory offered him the choice of any army he would command. He did not refuse, but pleaded the necessity of a short interval of leisure for the recovery of his health, and speedily withdrew from the conference in order to avoid any more such embarrassing offers. He had by this time, evidently, a very clear perception of the course before him, and had made up his mind to place himself in circumstances to confer high offices and commands, instead of accepting them. In talking afterwards to Madame de Remusat about this period in his career, Napoleon said, "The Directory was not uneasy at my return. I was extremely on my guard, and never in my life have I displayed more skill. Everyone ran into my traps, and when I became the head of the state, there was not a party in France that did not base its hopes on my success."
This concludes today's reading of the military career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Join us also next week for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.